If you are still having coffee or water outside, come inside and take seats. Okay, I want to start with one important informational announcement about the next coffee break after this segment. The next coffee break will not be in the room in the back. Will be at the place where you registered this afternoon, made the registration. So the next break will be just a coffee and some cookies outside in the registration area, not in the room. So that room will be closed for the next break. Okay. Are there any other announcement I should make, Amanda? No, that's it. Okay, good. So we are starting the afternoon part now. And the first paper in the afternoon, as I announced, is Masa's own paper. And I want to talk a little bit about the background for this paper. In early June, when Masa was in hospital, he called me to his hospital room, so I visited him Saturday afternoon in June. And he told me there were a couple of things that he wanted me to attend to or take care of when the worst thing happened. I told him that I didn't want to think about the worst case scenario, but I listened to him. And the first thing he told me was about this paper. He told me the paper is in revise and resubmit status with a top journal, and he really want to see this paper published or completed and published. And he told me he asked the two people to help him complete the paper if the worst thing happened. One, his former student and economic theorist who can help this paper with in the theory part. And as we will see, this paper has both a theory and economic history. So he asked another person, Masaki Nakabayashi of the University of Tokyo, he's an economic historian, to take care of the history part. So he told me he made those arrangements, so he wanted me to make sure that they will complete this paper and submit this to, or resubmit this to a journal so that it will be published. So after the mid-July, I talked with both Chahua Che, who's a theorist who should complete the theory part of this paper, and Masaki Nakabayashi, and they had been working together to complete and publish the paper. And back in July, when I had to carry this news, Chahua was actually here at Stanford because he flew from Shanghai, Hong Kong, or wherever across the Pacific, hearing Masa was gravely ill. So we talked, and he agreed to continue revising this paper and publishing it. And today, he is here again, Chahua is here again, to present a paper for Masa. The paper is titled Three-Person Game of Institutional Resilience versus Transition, a Model and China-Japan Comparative History, unless you have changed the title. No, okay. Chahua. Is a slide here?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to present my advisor's work. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's actually a graduate from Stanford. Masa is my advisor, and it's a great honor to come back here to talk, and it's a great honor to present Masa's work, his final piece of his work in his life. So, so this is the picture of Masa in his last days when he was communicating with us and working on this paper. So the paper we have done according to the referee's comments and editor's requests. We have did some revisions, and this what you see here is the revision. So so the question come to my mind when I look at Masa's work is why Masa did this three-party games. Why we do three-party game in talking about institutional resilience and institutional transition. Now, typically, when we talk about institution, we often do in a binary case, is two-party, So institution is simply from old to new, okay? But the reality is, oftentimes post-institution, after you have institutional transition, you go into turmoil, okay? Without new working institutions settling down. In other words, old is gone, and then what? Okay? So the question, what we try to do in this paper is why some institution transition went seemingly quite successfully and smooth, whereas other institutions went seemingly terribly wrong. Okay? And this very question brings us to the comparison between Meiji Restoration in Japan and Xinhai Revolution in China. Now, there's something wrong with this. There has been large literature comparing Japan and China. We do a little slightly different. Okay, the two countries was very similar to begin with, and then after the revolution took place, they evolved very differently after point on. Okay, so prior to transition, both countries faced external challenge to their sovereignty, together with domestic political instability, as a result of weakened sovereignty. Both countries had a political institution with very diverse political power. In the Japan case, you have bakufu and Han federations. You have a shogunate and then have little different hands, okay? Which basically is a feudal domains. And in China, you have a feudal monarchy, which is at the time was Manchurians, with the rise of local gentry of the Han ethnicities. So both structure before the transition was quite similar. Now, the transition, both countries respond to the crisis by abandoning their old political institutions. In the Japanese case, the shogunate was finished. In the Chinese case, 1,000 years of monarchy came to an end, with a slight difference. The difference is that when the shogunate ended, there was a war. There's a Boshan War. The Chinese monarchy ended seemingly quite peacefully at the time. There was no big war. However, afterwards, the two countries diverged quite a lot. Japan implemented broad and far-reaching reforms, okay, and Western technologies adopt rapidly. There was a massive increase in production and infrastructure. And the country strengthened very quickly and rising to challenge China and Russia. In the whole process, the country went quite peacefully, except a short period of rebellion by the old samurais. China, on the other hand, also tried to implement many reform measures, but then they backtracked. And then, with all these reform efforts, there was a prolonged period of conflicts domestically, as well as facing the aggression by the Japanese. There was economic development, but mostly restricted to the area where the Chinese state capacity was not able to reach. because there was a lot of concession area and the this foreign influence area where the Chinese sovereignty cannot reach, the economic activities taking place. But the places where Chinese sovereignty can reach, the state capacity can be felt, there was very little economic development because of all the fights. In the end, of course, China was not able to defend against the Japanese invasion. Okay? Now we quote the famous Chinese scholar at the time, Lu Xun, said that all that happened is Manchu, which is the ethnicity that ruled China during the last monarchy, left the feast. So now we came back to say, right, we try to understand how the institution path, the institution transition paths diverge, why we need the three-party games. So the question, once again, what we have in mind is why some transition was successful, some seem to stumble. And we would argue in this paper that, first of all, the preference ideology difference, okay? Parties, different parties, may gang together to overthrow the existing ruler. But once they overthrow the existing rulers, their ideological difference may cause them to have another fight. Okay? Now, if they do agree, then they can move on. Okay? So the ideological difference, so they may have big ideological difference with existing rulers, but also they also have the ideological difference between themselves. The ideological difference between the rulers and them compel them to overthrow the ruler, but the ideological difference among themselves compel them to fight again. If the ideological difference is small, then they may move on, okay, successfully without fighting. But more importantly, we argue in this paper that even though after institution transition, in some countries, in some cases, different political parties may continue to fight on, the conflicts are not always destructive. In fact, it can be an important channel through which a nation consolidates, it expands its state capacity. So that, as a result, nations with very weak state capacity may have to go through a very long period of conflicts to consolidate, expand state capacity so they eventually can emerge from ashes. Now, if we look back to Japan and China, in the Japan case, if you think about how they overthrew the shogunate, there was two major political forces. One is called the Chushu Han. There's one of the feudal domains called Chushu. And the other one is Satsuma, okay, together with Tosa. Okay. These people fought together against the shogunate, and afterwards, there was not much conflict among themselves. In Chinese case, initially it's similar. There was uprising by a large contingent of different political forces, including what's later become the Kuomintang, the nationalists. Afterwards, all these political forces fought against each other, including, in the end, the Communist Party. So we are going to present, the next what I'm going to do is present a simple theory model to try to deliver this message. After I present this theoretical model, I will talk about the historical narrative to mirror the theoretical results and the historic contents. So it's a very simple theoretical model. There's an infinite horizon with an infinitely lived three different political forces. There's R as a ruler, A and B as two political forces. Okay? And they have, the R has this, this ruler has a state capacity called MR, but the two political forces also have their own state capacity, MA and MB. The add together is less than 1. One is, think about, you can think about 1 as the total state capacity can be employed in the country. When M is less than 1, that means there are some state capacity slackness. You think about in this way. Think about there are lots of people simply not mobilized, okay, to contribute to the public goods, for example. They don't listen to any of the government, okay? So this is what we think about, there's a state capacity slackness. And let's just say the three parties, M, R, A, and B, they have state capacity ratio is this small r, A, and B, okay? So that's the ratio. Now, unless a political force is consolidated, okay, gets consolidated, this political force is essentially be defeated, okay, then the R ratio falls this way. It's R, the ruler has the biggest one, and the second is the A guy, the A political force, and B political force is the smallest, okay? So that's the initial stage they begin with. And the three parties also differ in ideology, with the ideology difference being A and B, the two political parties that are not ruler, they have an ideology difference among them, between themselves. And if they also have ideology difference between the A and the ruler. Okay, B and the ruler, they also have this larger political difference. They do not agree with what the ruler does. Okay? So the economy is ruled either by one political party, which called as monopolized government, or by two political parties, which call a joint government or coalition government. The challenger can either challenge, you can have the two people that are not rulers to challenge the rulers, or if you have coalition government, you can have one party challenge the other. One member of the government challenge another, okay? Challenge is either successful or not successful, with probability depending on what we call contest function. So basically, what happens is the following. So economy starts with the government ruled by R. Then this political force A can decide either to challenge or not to challenge. We assume that B is very passive in the sense that he do not actively directly challenge R. All he does is that once he sees A is challenging R, then the B decides whether he wants to side with A or side with R. He either helps A to challenge R or collaborating with R to consolidate R's power. If B is with A, then the conflict is between AB and R. If B is with R, then the conflict is between A and RB. Okay? If there's no A does not decide not to challenge, then there's peace and production. If there's a challenge, there's a conflict. There's no production here. Okay? Now, if the conflict is successful, the first conflict is successful, what you end up is the AB government, a coalition government with AB sharing power. If failed, then the R government continues. Otherwise, if this conflict between A and RB, if it's successful, okay, A challenge is successful, then you form your A government. Fail, the B R government. If it's a peace here, then R government continues. The important thing, what we want to analyze, we will analyze, is what happens after the AB jointly challenge R and successful. Think about Chushu and Satsuma. They jointly challenge the shogunate, and they successful, they form a government, new government. In this case, this AB government, then they themselves decide whether to challenge each other. If they don't challenge, there'll be peace and production. If they challenge, there'll be conflict between A and B. And then in the end, either you have A government or B government. If you have peace, then you have A, B government continues. So that's basically the structure. So the important mechanism here is the winner of a conflict consolidate losers state capacity. So all the losers company will go to the winner. That's what you call consolidation. And furthermore, through this conflict, a winner also acquires a portion of the state capacity slackness. There's 1 minus m that is not belong to anybody. The portion of it, alpha portion of it, goes to the winner. Okay, that's what we call mobilization. And now, why the state capacity is important? Because the state capacity of the government, of the ruler, determines the output. Okay, so everybody's payoff in each period, or the well-being, determined by the output and the ideological difference. If I'm the ruler, I do the way I like, so I don't lose anything. If I am not the ruler, I hate the way rulers does things, then I will suffer this Z, okay? And the Z can be a small I or big I, so the ideological difference can be different. So, and of course, if you challenge, if there's challenge, there's some dead weight loss. Okay? Let me skip these things. So, in the AB case, if there are peace, only if both people, both A and B, they want peace. If one of the party decide to not have peace, then they won't have peace. So this is, let me show you this diagram. Okay, so this is, can you hear me? So this is, on the top here, that's the return to conflict for A. And here is return to peace for A. Now, the important thing we realize is that the return to peace for A is steeper than the return to conflict to A. Meaning that as the state capacity grow, you find less willing to engage in conflict. Peace become better. Now, why peace become better when the state capacity becomes bigger? The reason is, one of the major reasons you go to fight, go to conflict, is to acquire the state capacity slackness, this 1 minus m that does not belong to anybody. When m becomes larger, the state capacity becomes larger, the slackness becomes smaller. So therefore, there's less for you to gain from conflict. And therefore, this one, the gaining of this return to conflict is flatter, okay? So as the state capacity grows, there's smaller gain to engage in conflict. But when it's small, the gain is larger. Why? Because when you have very little state capacity, maintaining peace is meaningless because the state capacity will still be very low. But if you try to engage in conflict, the state capacity, as your effort to mobilize people, will grow a little bit. So here it's bigger, right? So therefore, when state capacity is low, you do not conflict. When the state capacity is high, when you do engage conflict, when the state capacity is bigger, you stop engaging conflict. So that's basically the story between A and B. So we can derive several implications. First of all, if the cost of engaging conflict is small, of course, you're more likely to engage in conflict. Ideology difference bigger, you're more likely to engage in conflict. If you are more able to mobilize people, you're more likely to engage in conflict. If the power balance between two parties are very imbalanced, you're more likely to engage conflict. If the productivity of technology, think about this one, think about that the Western technology suddenly has come, that you realize that consolidating power is so important, then you're more likely to engage conflict. So I will skip the mobilizing this big, the AB government, remember, the AB government, the coalition government, came from they together defeating the R government, the ruler, okay? So before the AB government was formed, there was R government. So the question next is, knowing that AB government was not stable, they may engage in conflict, will AB jointly challenge R in the first place? And if they do jointly challenge R, will there be conflict or peace subsequently? So that's basically what we try to do. And this is a little bit engaging. I will skip this one. Basically, what we show is the following. That is, in some cases, okay, in some cases, depends on two cases. In one case, you can show that our government, this ruler, is more likely to be facing a joint challenge if its political structure is much more diversified. Remember, we talked about this, right? So this is what we show, that its political structure is much more diversified, then the gain from jointly challenge this R government, it becomes higher. And of course, this is the second observation is very straightforward. If the ideological difference between A and B vis-a-vis this ruler is larger, then there'll be more joint challenge. Let me skip this part. So now let me return to the China-Japan comparison through the lens of the three-party game we just built. Let me start with major restoration. So we think that major restoration, the reason major restoration went smoothly afterwards was because, first, there was a smaller ideological difference among key players. Perhaps also thanks to the fact that they maintained during their overthrow of shogunate, they maintained institutional ability to resolve difference among key players. Second, remember there was a Boshin War fought by the Choshu and Satsuma against the shogunate. This conflict prior to the major restoration may have helped strengthening the state capacity. In contrast, in the Xinhai Revolution, there's a much greater ideological difference among key players. They lacked an institutional ability to resolve differences, and there's a weaker state capacity, and only to be strengthened through prolonged turmoils. So let me go into a bit detail about why Japan has smaller ideological differences. First of all, towards the end of shogunate, the inefficiency in the Japanese system was rather clear. The two bad economic policy, there's restriction on land and the labor market. Okay, so severely imposed on the restricted resource allocation. Second is you look at the Bakufu Han Federation, the shogunate structure. Essentially, you have one country, within one country, you have many small kingdoms. All these kingdoms need to raise armies to defend themselves. So essentially, there's duplication and excessive employment of armed forces within the country. So if you centralize, all these excessive employment and duplication of resources can be eliminated. So the efficiency gain can be achieved. There's a very clear efficiency gain can be achieved. However, in the meantime, exactly because you have the structure, that this shogunate has a Bakufu and Han Federation structure, because the Han are competing against each other. This political competition itself actually can encourage did encourage the emergence of remarkable political talents, especially at the lower rank samurais in the Japanese case. So if you look at the Meiji Restoration and the overthrow of shogunate beforehand, these lower rank samurai played a very, very important role. Furthermore, the external environment in the late 19th century also mattered. At that time, constitutional monarchy, in terms of political institution, constitutional monarchy seemed to be a standard. Okay, very few countries diverge. Modern countries diverge. Sorry, not modern. Advanced country at the time diverge. There was stable free trade system, and market economy seemed to be unchallenged. And remember that the shogunate was overthrown, but the monarchy was kept. And this tradition has always been there in Japan since 1192. So it's a prototype of constitutional monarchy was already there. It's a part of the history. So if you look at the Japanese case in that time, there's a smaller choice set for the next regime. Okay, so there's very little ideological differences. Also, they maintained and enhanced institutional capacity to resolve difference because despite the fact that the shogunate was gone, the monarchy was kept. So the monarchy provided a platform for them to resolve difference potentially. Furthermore, in the Japan case, there was earlier consolidation of state capacity. First of all, before the overthrow of the shogunate, these different hans or different feudal domains, they themselves are pretty well organized. And that's pretty much explains how they can fight with each other, and probably the fact that they fight each other help them to motivate them to strengthen their own state capacity within their territory. So they have strong state capacity within each region to begin with. And then the Boshin War serves a very important channel through which they consolidate. Essentially, throughout the Boshin War, in the Boshin War, the Tokugawa family, which is the family that ruled the shogunate, was all the way battled to Hokkaido. Okay, it's a long journey fighting. So at the end of the fighting, the land and the military force of the shogunate was all confiscated. And this confiscation was further propelled other hands to turn over their territory as well as military personnel to the central government. And with their property rights, remember there's a land reform as well as labor market reform, peasants was supporting the new regime. But more importantly, we think that the fact that there's inefficiency, the clear inefficiency during the shogunate period, and once you have Meiji Restoration, you can remove this inefficiency, and with the central government, there's quote unquote this efficiency improvement offer the country a brighter future in the back. And therefore, the country can leverage this brighter future to buy out the current stakeholders. In fact, if you look at the way the central government dealing with the hands, essentially they offer all these financial instruments, the bonds, okay, with yield backed by the country of the future. And all these hands, the leaders, were willingly to accept these bonds. Now, without improvement of efficiency, without consolidated power, central power, without improvement of efficiency improvement, this cannot be offered. This is in contrast with China. China, on the one hand, has a much larger ideological differences. First of all, by that time, remember, the overthrow of the shogunate and the Meiji Restoration happened in 1860s. Okay, China's Xinhai Revolution took place in 1910 around 1910. So it's the time was different, and therefore the world is different. Now the world has much wider range of political institutions to choose from. You have constitutional monarchy, republic, socialist state, all these things. Furthermore, in China, as compared to Japan, there was a centralized, it's all tied to the monarchy, this particular talent selection system we call civil service examination. So you create a bunch of intellectuals with very similar view, okay? Little exposed to the outside world. So if you look at all the political leaders around the time in China, they obviously lacked visionary leaders. But on the other hand, these ideological differences maybe have been a blessing because conflict or state consolidation, state capacity consolidation, expansion through conflict may have been what China needed at the time. Furthermore, the overthrow of monarchy, China was not like Japan. You have a shogunate and an emperor. China has this one central government, this monarchy. Once you overthrow, there's no institutional platform for different political party to resolve their difference anymore. So there's a vacuum of authority. Also, China had lacked a tradition to consultation, discussion, and the elites were skepticism of democracy. Throughout the Chinese history, there are always, things are always solved by revolutions. Furthermore, why China had a weaker state capacity? Remember, we said in the beginning, Shanghai Revolution went seemingly peacefully. Okay, there was not a lot of fighting. As a result, many different localities, there are lots of warlords, they're simply not consolidated. Furthermore, around that time, the world was become more peaceful as compared to 19th century. There was renunciation of war against as a diplomatic instrument, and there's a Washington regime, so China's independence seemed to be guaranteed. With a safer environment, the warlord federations seemed to be tolerated. Okay? Of course, the KMT, the Kuomintang, did engage in northern expedition, but toward the end of northern expedition, the consolidation was mostly achieved by compromises with different warlords, by allowing the warlords to maintain their personnel control and political control at their local jurisdictions. But in the end, let me say why China needed conflicts to engage, to strengthen and expand the state capacity. China at that time faced an environment that went through a period of history that it had repeated transgression on sovereignty. And these repeat transgression came with much more advanced technology as compared to the country. So the country seemed to be in a downward spiral, okay, unstoppable downward spiral. So we can argue that the only answer to deal with this repeated transaction with much more advanced technology lies in China's quote-unquote competitive edge in warfare, which is population. So basically, you need to mobilize population. Where the populations are in the rural side. But in the rural side is where the state capacity was not reaching it. So it took actually lots of effort through this warfare actually to engage these peasants to join the fight. And eventually, this Communist Party was able to be the eventual winner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We obviously run over the time, but I couldn't stop the presentation of Masa's paper in the middle. And I've seen this paper several times, and I also listened to Masa's presentation a couple of times, but I think that this was the clearest presentation I've heard today. And I'm sure there will be a lot of discussions, but let's postpone those in the break. And we go on to the second paper of this segment. And I invite Miguel to present his paper on corporate governance in Mondragon. Okay.
This here. Well, good afternoon. First, I want to say that I feel deeply honored being here today, together with all of you, to remember and celebrate the memory of Masahiko, along with Reiko, his wife, with their daughters, Kyoko and Maki, and with so many friends. Some weeks ago, after telling the organizers that I could be joining, and after accepting their invitation to talk, I must confess that I was getting a little nervous and overwhelmed, especially after looking at the list of opponents. Nevertheless, I felt then, and I feel also today, that I wanted to be here now with you. I want to believe that I was invited out of my sincere and deep appreciation also of Masa as a person, of his work and his way of understanding life, people, and organizations. Let me tell you first a little bit of my coordinates, and I proceed. I came to the farm, to Stanford from Spain, from the Rioja region, and after spending some time in Barcelona, I had joined the PhD program at the business school, survived to the courses, and I was interested in managerial economics, more specifically interested in theory of the firm, interested on the importance of people within the organizations, encouraged especially by one of my mentors in Spain. I was at that time a little lost, and it was then, after taking one of the courses that Masa taught about the Japanese firm, that I thought that I had found a topic. I talked to him, and I became one of his students. It is funny to think that I came all the way to Palo Alto from Barcelona, and that I could feel closer to a Japanese scholar and his approach about the Japanese firms rather than to the American firm, but that was certainly my case. I was feeling that way. Many of you have been friends of Masa for a long time, or his colleagues either here or in Japan or in China, with many opportunities to share time, working in meetings and projects with him. But in my case, it was a little different. After coming back to Barcelona, we only met from time to time. It's true that in a big number of conferences, but it was through those excuses, through some invitations or visits that we met. Now, I just wanted to mention 3 of these occasions to share with you the Masa I knew and this approach to research and how this has influenced my own research. The first one, of course, comes from my PhD days. He was an original and unique professor, quite different to the other professors that I have met in many respects. I love, for instance, his straw hat in the summer. He was easy to meet. He was generous with his time, not hierarchical, but a closer person with whom, as a way of warming up, I could always discuss about politics, about paintings, about the economic situation, and about food, especially about Mediterranean food. Of course, there was the problem of the accents, his accent and mine, and the issue of never being completely sure if I had understood all the hints he was passing to me in the meetings. But that was part of the learning process, I guess. From time to time, he would take me to the faculty club, and as you can imagine, for a Spanish PhD student, often tormented by the food at Tresidder, this was like a feast. Some other times, I was also invited over to his place with other students and friends. and with many conferences organized with interesting people like the CII people that it was mentioned before. It was the time just before the burst of the Japanese bubble and the beginning of the lost decades, when both the German type of firm and the Japanese firm were quite popular among scholars. The time also when professors Asanuma or Koike and other scholars visited Stanford. So I was learning a lot. I was working on the role of banks in the industry and the information exchanges, the idea of quasi-integration and the Toyota system and the informal contracts. I learned about the importance of banks and investors for firms, and also about the importance of employees in the Japanese firm, and I like it. It was the time for books like The Information, Incentives, and Bargaining in the Japanese Economy. After my defense, Masa invited me to celebrate it, and he cooked for me at his place. Coming from a culture where the PhD students would typically invite and treat the members of the committee to an expensive meal, I found his gesture much more generous, authentic, and elegant. I was really moved by that, and in fact, I have followed his example with my doctoral students. The second encounter that I will mention was back in Barcelona. It was the period of Spain joining the monetary union with dramatic adjustments and changes in the Spanish economy after that. And when the banking system, our system has always favored the presence of strong banks rather than strong industrial firms, was present there. Large banks with participations in the industrial firms and with interests in utilities or other firms offering public services, very big players. Then, one of the times he attended a conference I helped to organize in Barcelona, he asked me to join him in his visit to one of Gaudi's early works. Gaudi's architecture is so different, so unique, so fresh, that it's almost impossible not to be impacted by his control of natural light, the mix of colors, of color tiles, iron, stones, in crazy shapes and in the curves of its buildings. In Barcelona, there is a number of examples, the Sagrada Familia, La Pedrera, El Parguell, but of course, Masa already knew those places. And this time, he wanted to visit one place which was outside Barcelona, one that even many Catalans don't know, which is La Colonia Güell. That colony was built for the employees of a factory and their families. A sort of a small village with reasonable housing, educational facilities for children, promoted by some businessmen concerned about improving the living conditions of their employees. Gaudí has spent 10 years working on the design of a church there, the one that you can see in the picture, developing a new and highly innovative method of structural calculation, the hanging model, somehow like looking at the problems in a different way, like upside down. Visiting that church, we saw many of his solutions implemented later, a combination of leaning pillars, catenary arches, and peculiar walls. He fused structure and decoration following nature's hints inside and outside the church. And Masa wanted to explore everything, to understand all those solutions meticulously. And I learned somehow how the interaction between the private profits and the social dimension of the organizations through that visit. I think for Masa, economic relations went well beyond the role of managers, going into the involvement of employees and their necessities, the working place and its impact on society too. A broad approach that Gaudí practiced and that Professor Aoki cultivated too. That was the time toward a comparative institutional analysis, that book. The third episode did happen at Stanford first, and then back again in Barcelona, the first encounter. One of the summers, 2003, I came with my family. As a PhD student, I was single, so some years later, I wanted to come back with the family and expose them to the Stanford experience. After Masa had met Marta, my wife, back also in Spain several times, and knowing her a bit more, and also her talents, who are many, He told me, "You're a lucky person." In fact, he told me that in his view, I was the more fortunate side in the couple. Well, I took that as a Japanese compliment to me, although I may be wrong. As you can imagine, Martha, who was already very fond of him, when she heard that from me, much later, of course, confirmed that he was really a wise man. The thing is that having been invited one of those days during that visit to the Aoki's house, we were there placed with two very active and quite vocal Spanish girls, 4 and 6 years old, whose main entertainment that day was also to call rather loudly Masa's name, Masahiko, Aoki, and laugh, because they both like how it sounded. If you add up to this that there was another invited family, a Japanese one, all dressed up in perfectly matching Armani clothes, and with two teenagers who were seated reading books in a very civilized manner, you will understand that that time was memorable for us. Martha was getting uneasy, but I knew that Reiko and Masa were amused and delighted. My point here is that he and Reiko too were patient people, open-minded, and fond of other people, who knew how to enjoy with others and who were always curious to learn new things and experiences. And as an example of that, that same day, when I asked Masa, as I used to ask when we were meeting, "When are you planning to come to visit us in Barcelona, in Autónoma? Is it going to be soon?" He gave me some homework. He had read of his famous restaurant, El Bulli, and about Ferran Adrià, and he was intrigued. So if I managed to get a reservation, he could adapt his agenda and organize a visit. At that time, Ferran Adrià was known, but he wasn't yet the big media phenomena. But that was a challenge. That was much more than eating. This was Gaudi's architecture brought to the kitchen. Just to give you an idea, Ferran Adrià's restaurant seated 50 people, was open only from April to September and only at nights, one shift. To make a reservation, you could only apply starting on January 8th, either through fax, email, or the phone. But for every table that was available, they had more requests than for each position that GSB has for the MBA program. I read later that first day that I was trying to apply, 30,000 petitions were coming for the season, for that week. And he was starting to be well known. I did my homework, I diversified risks, I combined all the techniques and suggested different days and crossed my fingers. We managed to get a reservation and they came. In our culinary exchanges, I had sometimes prepared for them a tortilla española, Spanish omelette. But Ferran Adrià deconstructs it. Using his words, first he reduces the old-fashioned tortilla to its 3 components, eggs, potatoes, and onions, and cooks each separately. Taking a dish that is well known and transforming all of its ingredients, or part of them, then modifying the dish, texture, form, and its temperature, deconstructed such a dish will preserve its essence, but its appearance will radically differ from the originals. Those are Ferran Adrià's words. And this is a Spanish omelette in Ferran Adrià's image. Eating well is something you can do at home, he used to say, but the point was to offer something which is more than eating, it's an experience. It was great to watch Masa's face when we were eating and we were having the 30 plates of the menu. And later when we managed to visit Ferran Adrià inside the kitchen and talk to him. Such a different couple of people, but how Masa was listening to him with great attention and admiration and asking more details about his approach. That also said many things about him. Somehow, I think that Aoki was trying to do something similar to Ferran Adrià with the business corporation. Able to take the main ingredients, managers, investors, and employees, transform them, combine them, looking at them in a different way, so as to reinvent the corporation. reinventing the corporation, that's something which is needed. There were more occasions, like meetings in Kyoto, visiting him and his beautiful house, other visits in Spain, including a visit to Bilbao in the Basque Country, with a trip together with Kyoko in the family car. Also the visit in Beijing with the occasion of the International Economic Association to check the energy and the power of the Chinese economy, as he was explaining to me. The last time I talked, anyway, was the last time I talked to him was last December. We had started to do the bureaucratic paperwork to promote him to an honorary PhD at Autónoma in Barcelona. And I wanted to confirm his permission. And I was also thinking of proposing new challenges, a new restaurant in Girona and a visit to Mondragon, the cooperative group. So that's why I wanted to tell you about Mondragon. We need somehow, there is this issue, and I think it was also important for Masa's approach. We need to reinvent this type of business corporation. We have employees, we have managers and investors with interactions, we have ownership issues, very severe ownership issues, short-termism and commitment, social effects of the corporations and challenges on that, cognition going beyond the individual approach. And in fact, if we were talking to this type of motivation, what do corporations do? What is the main goal of a firm? And this was the beginning of his last book also. We have a private interest, but we also have social interests. Who takes care of those social interests? In any case, there is this type of interdependence. And I thought that these corporations in evolving diversity, which was the title of this Masa's last book, was very challenging. Human cognition is not only individually done, it's also collective. That's a very important idea. And I think firms, organizations, the way the firms are organized is very important. This system of associational cognition that he was mentioning. The first main goal of the corporation is to produce and deliver things. I mean, it's not just always maximizing shareholder value. It's to service people, communities, and nations. To achieve this, the firm must engage with many other parts, engage with investors, with employees, with suppliers, with communities, with customers, with the stakeholders. So there is this idea not only of control, but also the idea of commitment. And there could be some kind of difficult balances among these two ideas. And this could affect also the operations of the corporation. We have both control and commitment issues, as Colin Meyer put it in his book, Firm Commitment. But the corporation is not only a control device, it's not only authority, and Ken Arrow was also mentioning this morning, it's also a mechanism for providing commitments to others. And the thing is that firms growing and evolving, and sometimes we become these very powerful and these unaccountable type of directors and managers. We have the presence also of many external effects, externalities, positive and negative. And the thing is that we can grow today, or we could ask ourselves, can we grow today without compromising the wealth of future generations? So that was also things which were in the Masa's work. Also, what about the basic rights of other people, like health rights, education, housing, sustainability and equality, important issues. Yesterday or 2 days ago, we had this very good example of the American approach to philanthropy with Facebook. But in Europe, in Canada, direct taxes and state involvement is providing also these type of things. How much of externalities effects are we going to accept until interfering in this type of normal activities? We need this type of governance. We need this type of active things. In the economics, in current economics, incentives and control are the main concerns. And I think this is because we have done very important contributions in those ways, enhancing the choice, competition, liquidity, the discipline of the markets, and so on, providing more freedom for consumers, facilitate competition, and promote liquidity are going to facilitate many of the things. But it's also true that doing this, we are going to neglect, we could also affect important things in terms of commitment within organizations. And these type of effects on commitment of the different participants may bring some kind of disastrous consequences also for us. Economics, and it's Kenneth Arrow again who is talking here, economics errs in failing to recognize our social dimension, our dependence on others to assist us to achieve what we want, and the importance of our commitment to them. I think that was also included in this Masa's approach. In the current, I'm not good with this simultaneous thing, huh? In the current view of the firm, shareholders are the owners, and then we hire, and they are going to hire the managers. Employees are going to be like the hands of the firms. But I think it's also true, and you will agree, many of you with me, then what about the brains of the firms? Shouldn't the brains of the firms come also from the employees? What about the knowledge they have accumulated? What about their contribution and suggestions? From the very beginning, I think Masa was following this type of broad approach. And many of the issues in human resources management were coming from the Japanese firm or from some kind of the European tradition. We seem to have reached a limit. Employees participate in decisions about what happened close to her working place. Can we go further with that? On top of that, I think there are two things, two changes which are in place. First of all, there is this, we are facing a new kind of context where employees' knowledge may help to create value. Investments on a specific human capital can be quite relevant for the firm, as it was mentioned also this morning. And contracts are not enough to protect this type of investments. Firms say employees are a strategic resource, but they are in the board of directors, not many of them. Maybe it's time to develop new legal forms. Margaret Blaird with law and economics and approach and how to protect its specific investments, it's one thing. And Aoki's contribution, Masa's contributions with this evolving diversity, with these cognitive aspects of the organization, with this collective approach and these systems of associational cognition could be an issue. I put here like this type of figure of chart where you could have, there's this type of ideas. Participation could go farther in our organizations. It could go into decision rights, but also in the cash flow rights. And I think we need both of them. We have some examples. Some of them are stronger in one direction, others are stronger in another direction, but I think we need to move forward in the two of them. I want to tell you something about Mondragon, which is this workers' cooperative in Spain, but just as a matter of taste. I think that this future firm includes tangible and intangible elements. We have to accumulate those intangible assets, and we have to do these type of efforts. Mondragon. Mondragon has more than 60 years of existence, and we are talking about more than 200 firms. Out of that, 100 of them are cooperatives. The other are kind of corporations, because when they move abroad, they cannot move as cooperatives many of the times because of the legislation. They have one bank, 15 R&D centers, one university, one MBA program. We are talking about more than 70,000 employees with international sales, with plants, 19 of them in China, 5 in the US, 6 in India. Some of them started in the 80s. And how they organize? Well, they organize with this type of divisions. They have like this type of industrial divisions, but also they have a section for like services, also for financial services, and then education and these type of elements. Although they are independent cooperatives, they are going to cooperate with each other. What are the advantages that they have? They have information advantages. People are better informed and have better opportunities, incentives to get education inside the firm, to carry out firm-specific investments. Decision-making for sure is more complex, as Hasman pointed out, but people get more involved. Higher motivation and social pressure can play a role. The group facilitates the approach to the challenges that individual cooperatives must face. And it encourages, on top of that, social responsibility. What do we need in this type of things? We need education to form managers and workers for this specific organization. We must start and search for a type of person, a type of manager, maybe specifically for this type of cooperatives. Probably yes, and for sure we need like a legal framework, especially in context with internationalization. Some of the key points that they have is the commitment, the emphasis on stable job creation. Spain is suffering still a very tough situation with more than 20% of unemployment, and these guys are putting the emphasis in this job creation and maintaining the jobs. Even in the current context, they were keeping to that, and they were creating jobs. Not many, but they were creating some. By being owned by its workers rather than being open to outside investors, its management was able to resist this stock market-driven short-termism. The employment security is within the group, not in the individual cooperatives, so they can be reallocated. And this allows them more flexibility. They can redeploy people. They are more agile, and it's grounded in efficiency and prudent management. The role of managers is very important here. In fact, they form their own cooperative, and they move the knowledge from one cooperative to the other. The idea is that in general, the financial crisis and recession have hardened attitudes to high executive pay, also in Spain. But in Mondragon, for instance, to give you an idea, the chairman of the Mondragon Group, with more than 70,000 people, earns no more than 8 times as much as the group's lowest paid member after taxes. They have job security, that's true, but where are they coming from? They are coming typically from inside. They move their knowledge around, and again, it's an example of this type of collective thing. And I'm ending. What do we need? I think for this type of organizations, we need managers, we need workers with firm specific knowledge in the organizations. The business school that they promote, it's also a cooperative itself. Overall knowledge of the group, the mobility of this type of knowledge is very important. And they have the ways and how of dealing with this type of problems, even problems pointed out by Colin Meyer when he was talking about transfers between different stakeholders, agency problems, intergenerational activism. It's not everything easy. They have some problems. Maybe we have to start some search also. I don't know if we can talk about, maybe we could try to be a little bit more homo cooperativus. I don't know. But for sure the legal framework, the internationalization, and the idea that if you move to China, they cannot be a cooperative as they are doing in Spain these days, it's a big challenge. They could also die of success. But I think those are the challenges that I want to, inspired by Masa, I would like also to continue and try to model and to do. This trust and commitment is always an important issue. So I wanted to finish with this, to tell you thank you, and to say hasta siempre, Masa. Thank you.
was a colleague of Masa at Harvard, I believe, and longtime friends of Masa. So,
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. It's a sad occasion, but you know, I thought of Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, at the funeral of one of his brilliant students who died very young. And he said, "There is no sorrow so great that does not find its background in joy. There is no sorrow so great that does not find its background in joy." Why are we sad? We're sad because we were so happy. I feel blessed with the life that I've had. And I know Masa felt the same way. And we were friends all our lives. Enjoy. So I'm sorry, but all that sorrow is sorrow based on joy. Okay. Oh, I have to put. Oh, here we go. Okay. Masa and I didn't do a lot of work together. We did edit a book a few years ago, but we did parallel lines, and we talked a lot about it. So what I'm going to do is start with some generalizations that of Masa's type thinking. If I can. Am I okay?
Yes, you have this. You can pass.
I have to look at that. I just want to look at this. Okay. Oh, thank you. Here's what I'm going to do. I wrote a paper with. This is not. I wrote a paper with Dirk Helbing, who's the head of the sociology department at ETH Zurich, which is kind of like Caltech of Europe. And we wrote an article called An Analytical Core for Sociological Theory. Sociological theory is an oxymoron. I'm not going to go into it here, but it is an oxymoron. There used to be sociological theory, but it died many, many, many years ago. And our argument was we're going to revive it. So we wrote this paper. Now, this first point is I want to talk about how you generalize the general equilibrium model of economics to deal with all of social theory. And then I'm going to talk about the stability properties of the general equilibrium model as we've come to know it, that is the economics Walrasian model. So here's what we have. We have a social division of labor. What is that in the world, in the society? It's a network of interacting social roles, okay? This is very important. A social role, the concept comes from me, Linden, Parsons, others. A social role is a set of, let me go on. The content of a social role is a set of rights, duties, material and symbolic rewards, and behavioral norms. In equilibrium, the content of social roles is public information. Everybody knows in equilibrium what's involved in being a mother, being a postal worker, being a professor, etc., being a physician. In periods of social change, of course, everything's up for grabs. It's all contested. That's the dynamics that we have to try to understand in society. And how is it resolved in periods of contestation? Well, through dialogue, through conflict, through murder, through cultural conflict, through political power, etc. So when you're when out of equilibrium, who knows what's going on? Role occupants are actors. It's called this in sociological theory. They fill many different roles. We model actors as rational decision makers who maximize an objective function subject to the content of the roles. In other words, if you perform as a mother or a postal worker or a member of the school committee, you are obliged to behave in certain ways, you're rewarded for behaving in certain ways, you're penalized, you have certain expectations. All of these game theoretic aspects of performing in a social role are what actors do. And when they take a role, in equilibrium at least, they know exactly what's expected of them, what the symbols mean, and all of that stuff. Okay, yes, that's good enough. For instance, if I go to Beijing, which I've done, and I hire a taxi, I know what the taxi driver expects of me, and he or she knows what I expect of the taxi driver. We don't have to negotiate anything. We know exactly I know where to stand to raise my hand to get a taxi. If I stand 20 feet over, they'll just pass me by. So we know all of these things. And this is how society works. It's an interaction of roles and actors that fill role positions. Now, how are roles organized? In general social equilibrium, roles are organized into organizations. And this is where Masa's work comes in. An organization is a set of interacting social roles, or an institution, even a family, or an NGO. It's just like a firm, except it's not just work, and it's not just a division of labor, it's an articulation of social roles. That's what an institution is, including businesses. So I'm going to enrich the Valrassian general equilibrium model by adding families, political institutions, private associations, etc. All of them are just like firms. Now, they're not trying to maximize profits, but it's simply not true that firms try to maximize profits. Firms try to compete and exist and grow and change and all sorts of stuff, and we're very lucky if we can come down to just saying they're maximizing profits. In fact, it's very hard to define what profits really are. It's not obvious in the real world. So here's the translation from the Valrassian model to general social equilibrium. Firms become organizations, networks of social roles. Family is just a family. Families, as in the general equilibrium, stay. Labor becomes an actor. A labor is just one form of action. And the roles you perform as a worker are just some subset of all roles you perform in society. And the price system stays the price system. Every organization, whether it's a family or what, a bowling organization, what have you, has to make enough money to keep going. It may have to hire people, et cetera, et cetera. So there's still the same constraints. Now, the point is, when out of equilibrium, the complete network of social roles and actor choices adjust. And that's true in the economy as well as in society as a whole. Out of equilibrium, everything adjusts, not just prices. Organizations adjust, sizes of organizations, the nature of education and formation, all those change out of equilibrium, not just prices. The same thing's true of general social equilibrium. Now, general social equilibrium, we model as a network of Nash and correlated equilibria. You probably know the term Nash equilibria because economists love Nash equilibria. I don't like Nash equilibrium very much. I think it's an extremely weak concept. But the correlated equilibrium is a very strong concept. And the correlated equilibrium is a primordially social concept. For instance, we have a system of traffic lights. The correlating devices are the lights. And we get signals as to how to behave. And in equilibrium, it's in our interest to follow the rules set up by the correlating device, which I often call a choreographer. So a lot of social life consists of institutions in which there are correlating devices such that in equilibrium, people have an incentive to do what the correlating device tells them to do, according to the social norms of the social roles involved. You can read about this in my book, The Bounds of Reason. By the way, in general social roles, you must include the fact that many social roles have moral obligations. In economics, we try to think that people are selfish or self-interested. We don't talk about morality. We don't talk about ethics. But in fact, it's there just as much in the economy as anywhere else. The idea that the difference between sociology and economics is sociology deals with morality and economics doesn't may be empirically true, but it's a disaster if it is. Because you cannot understand economic activity without understanding that there are moral rules and people will sacrifice in order to behave morally, or they won't. And when they do and when they don't is the key to how economies work. In a well-organized economy, people believe in integrity, they believe in trust, and they believe that they're going to be better off if they act in a morally acceptable way. In a society that's not working so well, they don't believe that at all. Corruption and hypocrisy rule. This is what you have to remember. So there's nothing different about the economy and the rest of society. It's just what we call the economy has a simpler set of institutions to work with. It doesn't cover the whole range of institutions. And of course then, economic roles are not purely self-interested. That's ridiculous. You think when you go to when you're doctor, when you go to medical school, do they teach you, well, you should just maximize your income? Just tell the patient what's necessary to get as much money as possible, huh? Or where do they ever tell you that except in business school? And you wonder why, there's so much business corruption. Well, of course, you go to school and they say, just get what you can get, The guy with the most marbles wins, Well, that's not the way society really runs, a working society. So there's no difference between general social equilibrium and general Valrassian general equilibrium. If you do them right, they're going to come up with the same problems. And by the way, my new book coming out soon, Individuality and Entanglement, deals exactly with these issues and some other ones that I don't have time to go into. Now, the last thing, I'm not going too fast. I mean, I have a lot of time, right? About an hour, is it? I want to switch. 7 minutes? No. That sounds more right, but Dale is very bored, and he's telling me I have 7 minutes. That's like when I get on the plane, I tell the pilot, you have 12 minutes to get me to San Francisco.
Don't worry, we'll signal you when your time is running out.
Well, I think when people start dropping over, I'll know. I want to talk. Here's the problem with general equilibrium, and it's a serious problem, and it's a problem that economists have tried to forget for a very long time, which equilibrium is wonderful, but you have to have a story of how you get there. Well, this is a disaster because we have no such story for the Valrassian general equilibrium model. I'm sorry Ken's not here. I talked to him a lot about this issue, by the way. In the 50s, after they proved the existence of general equilibrium under very wide conditions, plausible conditions, they tried to prove stability. Well, they failed. They assumed that out of equilibrium, there's a system of common prices. The idea of the auctioneer and tâtonnement. These are common prices, and they adjust them by the time rate of change of these common prices being a function of aggregate excess demand. This is very standard. That's what you learn when you learn the Valrassian model. The problem is they're never stable. What happened there? It was not successful. General equilibrium theorists tried to fix it for about 15, 20 years, including some of the greatest and my most favorite people, including Hirofumi Ozawa, Ken Arrow, Han, all sorts of people. But it didn't work. Tâtonnement cannot generally be stable. It's generally chaotic. This is work done in the 80s. It's generally chaotic. But who cares? Because the real economy doesn't have an auctioneer, and there are no common prices. And Paul talked about this morning. There are all sorts of prices running around out of equilibrium. So what we did, okay, the fact is, and you should remember this if you're an economist, we know nothing about the characteristics of out-of-equilibrium market behavior with lots of markets, with more than 2 or 3. And even with 2 or 3, we don't know a hell of a lot. That's why we developed a field called macroeconomics. I always wonder, why are there 2 fields? This is economics. What's macroeconomics? Well, macroeconomics does try to deal with out-of-equilibrium behavior, but it knows it can't do it using the Valrassian model. So it creates an alternative in which there's one firm and one representative agent and two goods, and then it adds to it so-called rational expectations. And rational expectations allow you to say anything you want. You then have very complex models about rational expectation change when there's no such thing as rational expectations. If we could solve the model, maybe there would be. What they say is, oh, well, if we can solve the model, then everybody rational person can solve it. Yeah, but you can't solve it either. I mean, the models that I've developed of dynamics, I can't even solve. I have to impose conditions on them so I know what the equilibrium is before I start, because I can't calculate it. Well, anyway, I'm not going to go on and on about this. Modern macroeconomics is smoke and mirrors. And the reason is that we don't have any dynamics of market exchange. We don't know what they are because no one's ever done it. Ah, but the knight in shining armor is us. I work with Antoine Mandel, Sorbonne. We go back to a fully decentralized Walrasian model. It's a complex dynamical system. We don't assume that there's common prices. Each agent has his own prices, private prices, and not everything. For instance, I don't know anything about Persian poetry. I don't have a price for Persian poetry, but I have a price for artificial jellyfish because I have some in my study, artificial jellyfish. And I know how much I'm willing to pay for them. And if someone offers me one and I think it's too much, I don't buy it. So I have a very small subset of all the prices in the economy. And each of us has a very small subset of prices in the economy. That's how our model works. They're called private prices. And those private prices act as the strategy sets for individuals who engage in exchange. I will exchange with you if, according to our private prices, which are not necessarily the same, there's some lens for a positive profit by both of us. And then we add to this something that gives you the equivalent of a replicator dynamic. Every once in a while, you can always adjust your own prices according to your own experience. You know, if you're selling bubble gum for $1 million a wad, you're not going to get many people buying it. Maybe you'll lower your price. But we do more than that. We say that every once in a while, someone observes someone else and looks at their private prices, and it can adopt it if he wants to. And he'll adopt it if that other person seems to be trading more successfully, having more successful trades. He won't know what his utility function is because those are all randomly assigned. But he will know whether he's trading or not. So he can adopt some of those prices. And that gives you a replicator dynamic. Now we have an evolutionary game. The Walrasian model out of equilibrium is an evolutionary game. The players are the traders. They produce in each period. They trade, and they consume at the end of the period. And they update their prices the way I said. And we can calculate the equilibria of this game. And we have a theorem from evolutionary game theory that says that every stable equilibrium of this game is, every strict equilibrium of this game is a stable equilibrium because it's called a multiplayer game. So if we can find strict equilibria, meaning strict Nash equilibria, meaning that each player loses if he tries to change the price, his own real price that he really uses. I can change the price for Persian poetry to whatever I want, I just don't consume it. But if it's something I consume, in equilibrium, if I change my price, I lose. If I raise my price, I can't sell anything. If I lower the price, I don't get as much for it, etc. Okay. There we go. Now, one more thing. I'll say it in words before I look at any of the math. What we show is that every strict equilibrium of this replicator dynamic is a market-clearing Walrasian equilibrium. Okay? So in other words, if you have they're equivalent. If you have a market clearing Valrassian equilibrium, then it's a strict equilibrium in the replicator dynamic, and therefore it is stable. Now, what I want to I don't want to go through a lot of math. I hate to do math when people are around. It's like, who told me? A friend of mine, Larry Krauss, I think, said, you should say to people, well, math is great and everybody should do it, but not in public. It's like sex. Great, but not in public. And so I'm not going to do a lot of math, but I want to tell you what's going on. First of all, we have a strategy for each player, and that strategy is just a price vector. But moreover, we have, I'll call it an exchange mechanism. And I guess I will use this. I'll probably destroy this. No. Oh, here. Oh, well, forget it. I just hated these things. I thought I press a button, I'm going to disappear. So there's an exchange mechanism, and we give what an exchange mechanism tells you for every strategy profile of prices for all the players, what is the allocation of goods to those players at the end of the period. And we're going to give conditions on the exchange mechanism that, when satisfied, render all market clearing equilibria strict Nash equilibria. And the kinds, I'm not going to go through all of the conditions, but it's something like this. Utility maximization, standard. Each agent maximizes utility. 2, seller competition. If there's excess demand for a good, in one period, there's some seller of the good who could gain by raising his selling price a little bit. He might not know it. He might not do it. No one in this model knows whether there's excess demand for the economy, because that's an aggregate. That's not something an individual knows. It's not in your information set. All you know is the trades that you've made, and once in a while you see trades other people make. So there's no aggregate demand. You can't condition any behavior on aggregate demand. However, if there's excess demand for an exchange process, an acceptable exchange process, then there is in fact some way that some seller can gain by raising his selling price. Now, there are lots of examples of where this is. The ones I use, I do agent-based modeling of these things. And I just say, well, people randomly make mistakes, and they randomly update, and once in a while, if there's excess demand, the ones who raise their prices are going to do better, and they'll be copied by others. They don't have to know there's excess demand. Similarly, buyer competition. If there's excess supply for a good, and there are two sellers with different prices for the good, the higher priced seller can lower his sale price in the next period a small amount without losing. Gains from trade. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's something like, if I have a buyer's price for a good and it's lower than any seller's price, then I'll never make an exchange. And similarly, in the other direction. The main theorem is, what is that? Uh-oh. Okay. Given the above assumptions, a strategy profile is a strict Nash equilibrium of the game if and only if it is P uniform for some micro market equilibrium price vector P. What that P uniform means, that there is a price vector for the whole economy, and each individual's price vector conforms to the aggregate price vector for the goods that he or she consumes and produces. That's P uniform. So this gives our major theorem, and the corollary is every market equilibrium satisfying the above assumptions is stable in the replicator dynamic. Okay, so what we find is stability. And by the way, there are many, many, many exchange processes that have all of these properties. And we go through in our papers a number of them. And I actually simulate some on the computer to show you not only do they exist, and not only are they stable, but they converge rather rapidly. The way I do it, to model this, I model as what's called a Markov process, which is equivalent to saying an agent-based model. They're equivalent, completely equivalent. And in fact, it turns out that, Markov models or Markov process approaches are equivalent to replicator dynamic approaches for large populations. This is work that was done by Ben Naim and Weibel about 10, 12 years ago. So if I can simulate it on the computer as a Markov process, I'm really simulating the equivalent of the replicator dynamic with continuous differential equations. You get the same results for a large enough population. You can't solve the Markov process analytically because it's astronomically large for even small numbers of markets, like 10, 20 markets. So what we do is, what I show is the following. This is work that goes back to 2007. If you start out with agents who trade with private prices, and each period they produce their own production good, and they seek out people to trade with to get their consumption goods. If you give them originally arbitrary random price vectors, eventually, and very rapidly actually, you get down to the point of where there are quasi-public prices. What that means is that everybody's still got their own prices, but the standard deviation of prices across individuals is very, very small. So everybody's very close to a single price. But they're never at a single price because there is no single price. Anyone's always free to change their prices any way they like. In the long run, these quasi-public prices converge to the market clearing equilibrium, always, in this model. Here's what it looks like. This is a model I did in the EJ, Economic Journal, 2007. You can see that you start out with the standard deviation of prices being 7, according to some thing, and they end up being 0.001 after 2,000 periods of trade, with people updating their strategies every 10 periods or so. That's quasi-public prices. Second, if you look at the excess demand, this is absolute average excess demand. It goes from some huge level, like 40, down to 0.00 something in 1,500 periods. So it converges. So we know theoretically that it has to happen, but it also happens rapidly. It's 2,000 periods. Now, here's the point. We know stability for systems like this, but the really interesting question is not stability, it's fragility. If you have a system, how does it react to shocks? You can have a stable system, it's stable, but if you bash it a little bit, if you tap it a little bit, it goes wildly all over the place before it comes back. So it's fragile. So I can test this for my economies. But what we really need for macroeconomics, let me preach a little bit, what we need for macroeconomics is a complexity approach that recognizes stability and models fragility and figures out what the shock absorbers are for the economy that allows it to have low fragility to shocks. That's a totally different issue than anybody is dealing with, except in Europe, obviously. People are actually working on models like the one I provided for you. But here's what I did in 2007. It's long. This is a complicated paper, and I don't have any time. Here are some examples. I have 10 sectors, and these are prices in the 10 sectors. I've organized it so that the actual equilibrium price is 1. But as you can see, there's huge. Look at that what do you call it? I forget what they call it in Markov process. It's way off the charts as a divergence from equilibrium. And it's not generated by any shock. It's just the internal operation of the economy. Endogenous resonances that occur just randomly. There's excess supply in every industry. This is great because that's what really happens in economies. Economies have except for certain goods that are have fixed quality, firms try to sell stuff. And it's hard. And supply exceeds demand, and they're quantity constrained. Well, you can see why in this model they'd be quantity constrained, if you think about it. If you lower your price enough, okay, you'll sell more stuff, but you're making less money. Unemployment is positive. It's around 4% in this model. Okay, I'll just finish. If you shock it, it returns. I'm here production shocks. And here are other production shocks. So I'll quit there. So that's what I think we have to do with this. And the same thing is true for social equilibrium. We don't have good models of social equilibrium. I mean, social dynamics. But we'll have to, I don't know how we should do it, but obviously it's an extension of Valrassian market dynamics. Thank you. That wasn't too bad.
I'm not sure if I followed everything you said, but it sounded like you, in your game, the equilibrium, the Valerian equilibrium is a strict Nash, so you get the stability, but isn't it different? Isn't it only local stability rather than the
Yes.
global stability? So when you showed the simulation,
You can't prove global stability because
typically
there could be multiple equilibria.
then
For
it cannot be
instance,
the case,
consider an economy that has two goods. They're
Right.
exactly substitutable for each other, but there's economies of scale. So only one of them ends up in the
okay.
in any equilibrium, but there's other equilibria that just use the other good.
Right. So in that simulation we are, so is that
Yes.
is that the situation with the unique equilibrium? Or?
Yes, well, the thing is, the way I simulate it, the way I do it on the computer with random everythings, there never is more than one equilibrium. I mean, I can run this, I can run it till I die, and I'll never see anything but the equilibrium that I created with equal prices. Now, that didn't have to be that way, but it is that way. If you add more regularity, if I tried to get multiple equilibria, I could obviously get them. Yeah, and then it would just be locally stable. But if you look at the real world, they're not multiple equilibria. I mean, as far as we know, the butter has a certain price in a country and it doesn't flip to a totally different price, the next day. So I don't think that's a big deal. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's take another coffee break here and come back here around by 3:20.